Hello and welcome everyone to this very special Squared Up coffee break on SCOM versus Azure Monitor, the big debate. I'm Richard Benwell, founder and CEO of Squared Up, and shortly I'll be introducing our panel that we have on today. But why first this debate? Well, if probably like me, you've been a little bit confused, maybe a bit frustrated by the different messages we've heard over the years now, sort of from Microsoft and sort of those working in the community around the different messages we've seen on SCOM versus Azure Monitor. A few years ago, we heard about OMS, Operations Management Suite, that was replacing SCOM. More recently, you might have been following the blogs and presentations from Microsoft on how they've killed SCOM internally and replaced that with Azure Monitor, and that's something they've discussed at Ignite recently as well. But on the flip side, we've had a new release of SCOM 2019. With some new features and still lots of life in it, as well as, of course, the Azure Management Pack for SCOM. So talk to the SCOM team, you might hear some messages around better together. If you hear what's coming out of the Azure team, there's not a lot of mention from SCOM. So lots of confusing messages. What we wanted to do was demystify the discussion, maybe cut through some of the PR and the marketing that we do here and get some practical advice about how we should be designing our monitoring strategies, both current strategies and future strategies. So that's what we'll be discussing in the panel today. Hopefully some of these sort of four questions. Does Azure Monitor replace SCOM? When should I still be using SCOM? When should I be using just Azure Monitor? And when should I be using them together and how to do that? So hopefully we'll get those questions out from the panel today. But most importantly, we need your questions to contribute to this debate. The panel here are here today to answer your questions. So please do engage with us, ask the questions that you've come to ask. You can do that via the GoToWebinar. If you're on the webinar live, obviously that won't be available on the recording, or you can join us on our Slack channel, which all you need is a web browser. MVPs and other sort of peers will be on that, ready for that debate. We'll post other links on that Slack channel, so blogs, videos, and other resources. And we're going to be running that Slack channel beyond this webinar as well. So if you are watching this on YouTube, jump over to that URL, and you should have details there of how to join that Slack channel and catch up with the debate. So please use either one of those mechanisms to send your questions over during the debate, and we'll get those posed to the panel. So our panel today, we have an absolutely fantastic lineup. It's very exciting to have everyone on today. Let me introduce them one by one, and then I'll hand over to Shawn, who'll be hosting the debate. So Shawn Williams will be our panel host today, taking your questions and putting them to our panelists. If you've been following the Squared Up Coffee Break series for a while, hopefully Shawn's name will be familiar. He was previously a sysadmin at Purdue University and has been on our webinars before, sharing his expertise around monitoring with SCOM and Squared Up. He's recently joined Squared Up as part of the Tech Evangelist group that we've just formed, who'll be sharing their knowledge and hopefully their passion for all things IT and monitoring with the community over the coming weeks and months. At Purdue, Shawn was an established user of SCOM, looking into Azure Monitor in its many forms, but I think was yet to adopt it before he left to join Squared Up. So hopefully he'll be representing many of our listeners today who are very familiar with SCOM, looking at Azure Monitor and trying to really sort of work out what's what in the world of monitoring these days. So that's Shawn, who will be our panel host, and I'll hand over to Shawn shortly. Hopefully you will see these guys on video, or at least three or four of them, so you can see what they look like behind their LinkedIn photo. So you get the real world and then also the LinkedIn world as well. So we have on our panel joining us Jesper, who was actually at Ignite recently. He's a consultant who works for Solver IT and also an Azure MVP. And at Ignite, he was giving two talks, one a deep dive into Azure Monitor, and then another talk on how his company had migrated their monitoring as a service from SCOM to Azure Monitor. So some hands-on experience there with trying to offer a monitoring solution using Azure Monitor instead of SCOM. We have David Allen, former SCOM MVP, who then went to work with Lloyds, the big insurance market based in London. So over the years, very, very familiar with SCOM, and I believe they still use SCOM there at Lloyds, but have also been adopting Azure Monitor alongside SCOM. So hopefully a good sort of hybrid monitoring story there too. Cameron Fuller, I hope, doesn't need much introduction. I'm actually joining this debate today as someone who's moved their role onto the world of Azure. So working with Catapult on an Azure solution they have. So I guess very much immersed in the world of Azure Monitor. But I guess his SCOM knowledge and work in the community is pretty much unparalleled. So hopefully he hasn't forgotten much of that SCOM expertise and can share that with us today. And our fourth panelist is Billy York, so consultant at 3 Cloud, who's blogging, I think, over the last few sort of months and years on SCOM and Azure Monitor, has deserved him a well-earned MVP award recently, so another cloud and data center management MVP, so specializing really in Azure Monitor. We were chatting yesterday and sort of talking about the experience of SCOM to Azure Monitor, and Billy described himself as having migrated himself from SCOM to Azure Monitor. So there's a real sort of personification of the migration from SCOM to Azure Monitor as well from Billy. So those are our panelists today, with Shawn hosting the panel. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Shawn to kick off the debate, hopefully work through some of those questions I put on that title slide there. But that reminder again, do drop questions on into the GoToWebinar chat or onto the Slack channel, and we'll get those handed over to Shawn to put to the panel today. So Shawn, over to you.
So I know Richard gave me the introduction, but I just wanted to kind of review for 1 second. I've worked with SCOM since 2005. I tried to do the OMS. I tried to adopt the OMS message. We never got there. My organization just wasn't ready for the cloud. So we just kept adopting SCOM and spreading it further and further. So we were a big SCOM shop, although the adoption with the other teams was kind of struggling. But just coming back and going to Ignite for 2019 and listening to Microsoft's new message about where they were going with their monitoring, where Azure is going, how it consumed OMS, and where SCOM was going. It seems like Microsoft has kind of come back a little bit, tried to change their message. So basically, I want to start with something that Richard said, was would each of the panelists recommend that somebody go forward with SCOM today? Would you look at implementing SCOM in a shop if you were given the choice?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. 100% I would. It's still a good product. What I would say is I think it depends on what you're monitoring and where you're monitoring it. If you're entirely on-prem, then SCOM can cover that just fine.
When you look at the Azure monitoring message today, would it be recommended for the admins to start looking at better together? Would they, where do you think the admin should look today? When you have the SCOM implementation on your site, what is it that you would think admins should start to talk about migrating?
So from our perspective, we started looking at our requirements for monitoring and starting to decide what it is we want to monitor, rather than be dictated to by the product what it is we want to monitor. So it becomes a hybrid, a joint story. We look at using Azure Monitor to give us the more holistic overview of our services, but we still use SCOM for the on-premise estate to give us the more granular monitoring detail that we require that Azure Monitor can't give us.
Okay, so when you talk about the hybrid message, what are some of the things that you would look at with the hybrid message that a SCOM admin should be aware of today?
Well, the first one is not to ship all your data up into Azure Cloud, into Azure Monitor from SCOM. That's going to be horrifically expensive and not really achieve you with much. During the expert panel in Ignite, I think Billy, you raised that the better solution there is to just send the alerts you want to notify on to add to Azure Monitor from your SCOM estate. So again, it's about reviewing what it is you actually want out of it. Monitoring in the past, in my opinion, has not been driven by the people who are actually looking at the alerts that are coming out of it. It's more being driven by what they're given. And we're trying to turn it back around and say, no, what is it we want to monitor? If there are things we don't want to monitor, let's not monitor them. If there are things there are, let's look at what we do want to do.
And I'll jump in on that if that's all right. So
sure, please.
A couple of other areas that we look at. So one is around monitor the monitor. You know, if you've got in essence what is 2 different monitoring products, that gives you a good way to be able to monitor, you know, how well is SCOM working itself, as well as on the Azure Monitor side of things. So there's a quick win there. There's other quick wins as well. I mean, there's some solutions that still exist related to from the OMS days that give you some functionality you can't do directly in SCOM. So that's another piece of it. And the third, Brian Wren hits this much better in the Squared Up webinar or the white paper that he did for y'all, but this concept of event correlation. SCOM is very focused on a particular object, a server, whatever that object happens to be. Doesn't do very well to figure out, I lost connectivity to a remote site and I have 50 computers that are, servers behind that site. So now I've got a WAN outage and I have 50 alerts from the servers that are down. It doesn't do that correlation to figure out, no, I don't have 50 servers that are not heartbeating. I do, but I don't care. I care about the fact that I lost the network connection. So Azure Monitor can give you that more holistic look across different data sets to tell you where the core issue is for situations like that. That's another point to definitely think about.
So, I want to pick on something you said there about the OMS, and actually stepping back to the OMS message, what changes have occurred? Can anyone speak to the changes from OMS to Azure Monitor? Because from my perspective, Azure, I'm going to use the wrong words there, OMS was more solution-based, and it seemed like you were trying to take some of that SCOM functionality to the cloud. When you look at Azure Monitor today as compared to OMS, what are some of the differences there? Like, how has it changed, in your opinion?
I'll start if you all don't mind and then hand it off. So one of the big things that I would say is different is in SCOM, in essence, you're getting pre-built management packs. That's that full set of, I'll use the analogy that you guys do the Lego Death Star, right? Okay. So think of those full built management pack as the Lego Death Star. It's basically being shipped to you pre-assembled and you just have the completed version of it. Okay. Which would be a cool service, by the way, if I could buy my Lego Death Star completely built. Side point. Versus if you're in Azure Monitor, it's kind of like they sent you the box of Legos with no instructions. So you kind of have to figure out how you're going to build said Lego Death Star with those components. The solutions kind of broach that gap in essence to give you something that's pre-built, but you didn't really tweak it. So like within SCOM, you can tweak anything. You can make overrides and change how anything behaves. The Azure Monitor, or the OMS solutions in essence were pretty much, they are what they are. You don't really tweak them very much. So they're kind of different from that perspective. That's my 2 cents, but I'd love to hear what the rest of the crew thinks.
Yeah, I'll go next. I 100% agree with that. That's one thing I like about Azure Monitor is you only set up the alerts that you want versus all of the alerts that get set up for you when you set up a management pack within SCOM. And with regards to solutions specifically, the way I think Azure Monitor is going now is to workbooks, and the benefit of the workbooks that I've seen over the solutions were built with the view designer, and oftentimes you couldn't edit them at all, like Cameron said, and sometimes the queries were kind of hidden. You couldn't see the queries that were used versus all the workbooks that Microsoft has put out for various Azure products within Azure Monitor. A, they're all editable, so you can modify them to any way you want, and then B, you can see the queries right off the bat that they use. So you can actually learn a lot about Azure and the Kusto language just by looking at the workbooks.
Okay, so a question from the audience, would it make sense to monitor on-prem Azure Monitor? Would you monitor, in other words, would you monitor Azure with SCOM? Has anyone done that, like with the Azure Monitor Management Pack?
Well, it depends what you're referencing there. What kind of services. So when you first move to the cloud, a lot of organizations will move just like IaaS, virtual machines to the cloud. And if you've got connectivity via Express Route or VPN, then you might continue your traditional SCOM monitoring approach of deploying the agent to that box and pulling it back into your SCOM environment. We're talking about Azure services and the Azure platform, then there are management packs out there to monitor that platform in SCOM. But again, it's deciding where you want that information and what information it is that you want to have, because Microsoft do publish a lot of health status pages themselves that can be referenced.
Which could be useful on the SCOM side of things. As a matter of fact, you could probably write a pack that would literally go through the status pages related to Azure itself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That would tell you, hey, is this up or is this down, and alert you if there's common Azure outages. You could do we've seen some recent Azure outages in terms of inability to even get into the portal. Synthetic web transaction. So you could probably build with the tool set you've already got in SCOM a pretty good high level monitoring for Azure. The way I do that, as an example, is I actually use Azure itself to do those alerts. So I have Azure watch the stuff that is relevant to me and send me an alert if anything goes offline. And then I've got a couple of flows that I put together also that keep an eye on some other core stuff and let me know if it sees something that might be an outage that I need to be aware of. But it's a good question. Cool idea.
So speaking to that a little bit, so what would be the best way to connect SCOM to Azure Monitor? Would you connect SCOM directly? Would you install an agent up in Azure, or would you just go with the management pack? Because I know, like in the OMS days, I connected my management group, and it was kind of doing like a connector almost, but it wasn't as reliable as I would have liked. Does anybody have any experience with that? Or is that something that no one else did?
Yeah, so there was the connection object, the connection ability, well, there is within SCOM to Azure Monitor or OMS, or what it formerly was, and then based on the solution packs you brought in, it pulled that data from SCOM into OMS, do the assessments, and then alert out on that. The problem with that approach is it's very costly, particularly if you load things like the security packs, as they were at the time, intelligence packs, because they would actually download additional management packs into your SCOM management group to go out to your agents to collect more data to send back to Azure Monitor or OMS, wherever the naming was at the time. The problem with that approach is that you're charged by data ingestion, and it gets very expensive. And again, if you're not looking at that data, it becomes a worthless cost. You're not getting anything out of that. So the approach I tend to go with is not to do that. And we've actually separated out now from our, I'm not saying this is the best approach, it's just an approach we've taken, is that we've reached a point where we've actually separated our on-prem and cloud environments completely. And the on-prem is managed by SCOM and cloud's managed by Azure Monitor, but for this single pane of glass, if we want any specific alerts being notified on, then it's only those from SCOM. It's only those that we'll forward to Azure Monitor to forward out on our behalf. But we don't actually have data flowing between the two anymore, because we weren't seeing any benefit from that.
Okay. So something you said it hit home for me, because when we were using OMS, we had the security pack installed. And you're right, we ended up sending up all this data, the cost exploded. So a common experience is blowing your budget in Azure with just your first monitoring experience. Any advice on limiting your costs in Azure when setting up Azure Monitor?
Yeah, definitely you can, if you do perf counters, set them to an appropriate collection interval, because that's a very, very expensive metric to add, and make sure you only add the counters that you want or you need, and then you can limit event logs to just critical or warning only. Cameron, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I did a top 10 blog post on this exact area. So behind the scenes, a lot of us were involved when this was even pre-log analytics type time frame, and we had workspaces that accidentally, which we did not do this on purpose, but accidentally were supposed to be 5 days or 7 days of retention and 500 megs of data, but they were unlimited. At some point in time, Microsoft determined that these existed and they fixed the glitch. And basically I went from having no restrictions on my data ingestion to significant ones. So I went through and blogged on the top 10 tricks that I used to pull that and rein that back under the free tier in essence. So a lot of the stuff that Billy was talking about there is very, very similar in nature on it, So I'd take a look at that, or we can get you a link to that one also.
Cool. Hey, we also don't want to ignore Jesper. Are you on the line?
Yeah, I am. I was just going to chime in on that, but I agree a lot on what was said. You need to consider what data you collect because it's very costly. So yeah, performance counters, events, everything you need to consider it. Only collect what you need to do your alerts.
So okay, let me just expand on that a little bit. So in SCOM, one of our major, I guess, pain points or benefits is you install Management Pack, you immediately get all this monitoring, and the first complaint is, oh my God, all this red. So the SCOM admin would then start paring back, start limiting all of those alerts. So in Azure, it seems like the opposite approach is true, where you would actually want to start with just what you need. So there's more of an investigation. What would you tell a SCOM admin today what they would need to do to prepare for the Azure journey? What skills would they want? Is it something new that they would have to learn, or just take that like reverse approach? Look at WMI, I don't want to get too specific there, but what conversation can we come around that we could tell the SCOM admin, here are the skills they need to go forward?
I'll give a shot at it. The first thing I would say is that a lot of your skills that you already have in SCOM directly apply within the Azure monitoring space. Monitoring is monitoring. It's just a different set of tooling that you're using behind the scenes. So the methodologies and the processes you put together and everything, those all apply regardless of what tooling you're actually going to use. A lot of the concepts of rules and things like that, that's how a lot of that, if you actually peel apart how Log Analytics did their solutions and things like that, it's all rule-based type stuff to begin with. So I think there's a lot of crossover in those skill sets. I'm curious what others think. And by the way, just so you know, the Slack channel is really lit. We got like 8 great questions out there.
Yeah, I've just been going through trying to answer some of them. What was the question? Sorry.
No, it's all right. It was around skills that the SCOM admin would use, because when you look at in SCOM, it was always like you would install a Management Pack and then you would just spend the time to pare it back. But in Azure, it's almost like you have to approach it from the reverse, where you would have to meet with your app admins, figure out what they want, and then adjust the monitoring for that to keep your costs low.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the same thing you do in SCOM with a discovery with your apps teams on what they want to alert on. It's the same thing you do in Azure Monitor. You go talk to whichever app or infrastructure team and then find out what their requirements are and go from there. So that skill translates for sure.
So talking about the app, so this is where I have absolutely no experience. When you're in Azure and you have an app, in the SCOM days, you would create a distributed application and tailor those alerts to that app. What would you do in Azure? How does that work there? Like, how do you get your app admins involved at that point? Or do you?
So with Azure Monitor, there's other components as well. So there's things like App Insights and Service Map tooling. So you can utilize the Service Map to draw out which will discover and draw out your service. And then you can use App Insights to break down at a lower level of monitoring, more like the APM level of monitoring that SCOM used to provide. And then you can have those discussions with your application teams as to what it is they actually want to see. I mean, as my colleagues here have alluded to, a lot of the technical skills of SCOM transition nicely over to Azure, but so does the approach of monitoring itself. And when you move over to Azure Monitor, you can use that as an opportunity to reset what it is you want from your monitoring, which enables you to have these more meaningful discussions with your teams. I would imagine most people on the call have had experiences where they've been in companies where they can't get input from the application teams to help them draw out the monitoring. So alerts just fly out all the time, and then they get ignored, and then they get auto rules set up to put the notifications into special folders. You want to try and get away from that and make the monitoring meaningful.
So, okay, speaking of the meaningful message then, so you mentioned like Service Map. How have you used that to like deliver a message to your users or your app admins, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, we're still in a position where a lot of our services, we've got a lot of services still on premises, and we've got some moving to Azure, and it's starting that journey of how we modernize that approach. So we're still playing around with things like service map at the moment to see exactly what benefits we can get out of it, because again, it's about making it meaningful. There's no point just shoving lots of information in front of people's faces if they don't know what to do with it or how to work with it, and that's what we really fear. We don't want to bombard people with information again, because they'll ignore it.
All right, so that's a similar SCOM theme. So in my shop, the admins would log on, they would either get the console or they would have Squared Up in front of them, and they would go to the all alerts view and they would see all that red. And the first thing they would do is say, I'm done, there's too much here. How does that change in Azure? Because I have no experience with presenting a solution. So I'm going to rephrase this question. In SCOM, I was successful when I created a distributed app and I had a presentation layer, and in this case, I'm going to use Squared Up. I had the Squared Up presentation layer where I showed them their specific alerts for their specific app. How do you do that in Azure? Is that like a workbook, or how is that through the native console? Do you give them access to Azure, or how do you engage your app admins so that they have access to what's relevant for them for their app?
So I'll chime in again on this. I mean, this is one of the reasons we're actually looking at Squared Up to publish to use in front of Azure Monitor, because we don't. A lot of our teams wouldn't get the benefit of going into the Azure portal and looking at Azure Monitor. It doesn't give them a meaningful place to look again. It doesn't help them. We always try and use the test of, if someone was waking up at 2 a.m. in the morning, how quickly could they work their way back to finding the root cause of the problem? Logging into the Azure portal is not going to be your first port of call for an efficient way of working your way back. So that's why I think it's important that you have some idea on how you want to present that information to make it useful and meaningful, and drill down to the root cause of the problem far more quickly.
Okay. So maybe taking a step back from that. So when you're in Azure and you're looking at it from the app perspective, can someone walk us through a common scenario of setting up an alert, tuning that alert, and setting up like maintenance mode for an application in Azure? What would be the common steps there?
Yeah, so there's for like app services and Azure functions, there's an entire list of metrics that Microsoft has put out, and those metrics are actually available against an App Insights workspace. So you can set them up that way. You can always do log-based alerts if you have to. My preference is to use metrics where possible because they're faster, and within Azure Monitor, they're stateful. Whereas log search alerts aren't typically stateful. So with applications, if your metrics available, I would definitely use that first. But if it's not, you can simply write a log search alert for it.
And then you just raise the alerts and go with it. I mean, I guess there's I have a disconnect between when there's an app. Does an app have its own workspace?
It depends on who you ask.
Okay.
I've seen some of my clients where they have, 50 App Insights workspace, and I look at them, I'm like, what are you doing? On the other hand, that there is a argument to be made for that if you don't want application team A to be able to see application team B's monitoring information. So you set up different workspaces with different RBAC controls on that. The guidance I've gotten directly from the PG is to use as few workspaces as possible for both log analytics and App Insights. So if you have one monitoring team that monitors all applications, just set up one. But if you're going to push application monitoring onto the teams themselves, it might be a better practice to create different App Insights workspaces for each of them.
So when you talk about different workspaces, then how, actually, let me rephrase that question. What about maintenance mode? How would you handle maintenance mode with an Azure workspace so that you could do maintenance without having the alerts?
You can use alert rules for that. That's a new feature. Came out maybe 3 or 6 months ago. Alert rules can apply to whatever alert you define and the scope you define. So any priority you want the alert to hit, you can hit that priority and ignore all alerts from that. You could also do text-based search within the alert. So any alert that contains the word domain controller, you want to ignore the alert from that one and do maintenance mode like that. So they're very, very flexible to use.
And here's a question from the Slack channel. SQL monitoring on Azure IaaS. Would anyone like to summarize that one?
Yeah, I answered it in the chat. Right now there isn't. You can't do it unless you create something custom, like Cameron was saying in the replies. But the PG is very much aware of that gap. I've raised it several times, and I know other people have as well. If you just needed to monitor if SQL's up, you could just monitor the key SQL services, and then obviously monitor the heartbeat of the server. But if you want to get deeper than that with SQL queries and if they're long running and whatnot, you've got to do some custom stuff, like Cameron said.
And let me peel that apart just a little bit later, just in case anybody's going to go this direction. So, we have the ability to be able to gather key metrics, performance, and events, and all that type of stuff directly from Azure Monitor via log analytics. Now, if you need to be able to get into something that's custom, so what you can do is you use the ingestion API. At first, that sounds like that's really easy. So, I can use an Azure automation runbook, which is going to reach out and it's going to gather that data. Well, it depends on the frequency of how often you want to do that. You really don't want, even with a hybrid runbook worker, you don't want to do that every 5 minutes. It's a lot of overhead to be able to do something like that. So in a situation of that nature, what I recommend is something like a locally installed service that actually writes to the ingestion API to be able to send up that data. So how you instrument it will vary dependent upon how frequent you need that data to be able to go and how much data you're trying to write, just in case anybody's going to go down that path.
There's also the toolkit that Microsoft IT used in their migration from SCOM to Azure Monitor. They have a lot of alerts based on SQL. So there's some inspiration to get from what you need to look for, at least.
Cool.
Just post the link.
So that's another interesting question. Does anyone have any more experience on Microsoft's journey to Azure? I know we all kind of talk about it, and there was some press about it, but it almost sounded to me when I read that blog post about Microsoft's journey was they switched how they were doing their alerting. Basically, they, instead of having the teams react to it, the teams kind of owned it. So they pushed monitoring out one level. Is that a common scenario with how, in your real life experiences, I guess? Are the app admins still the people you work with, or do they kind of set what they want in order to interact with all of this? I guess another way to say that would be, in SCOM, the SCOM admin generally pushed out the alerts. People reacted. Is the new way of looking at this where the app admins are more involved? Do they have more access?
I think they always should have been. I know when I was in SCOM, I was always trying to get the application, especially if you've got your own in-house developers or whatever, trying to get them to think about monitoring more from the start, and actively write so we can monitor it and advise what needs to be monitored. It's just it was very hard to get them on board. And then I think that continues in Azure Monitor. You still need to have decent monitoring. You need the application teams on board and involved in making sure the right items are being monitored and alerting in the right way.
Okay, so continuing along those lines, items that need monitored. What data sources I mean, what's available in Azure Monitor, like to monitor the Windows OS or its applications? It seems like you have all of the log files, but what else do you have? Are there APIs? Can you pull data from applications? What methods are available in Azure to kind of get all of that data out to your app admins?
I'll grab that. So I think Billy answered in the Slack chat the default ones. So Billy, if you want to reiterate those really quick, and then I'll throw in on API stuff.
Yeah, for Windows Server and Linux for that matter, you can pretty much monitor any performance metric that's available. Even if it doesn't show up in the log analytics list, you can add it if you know the counter name and the object name. You can do IIS services, Windows files, registry, and same for Linux on that. I think I might have missed one, but.
So, good. I mean, is it like everything gets in WMI or what?
I actually don't know where it's pulling a lot of that stuff. Like I know some of it's just off the agent where it's like this. It pulls the service that you want to monitor for the time that you set.
If you tear apart what it's actually doing, and by the way, this is a good thing if you're a SCOM admin and you want to have some fun. Do some event rule collection. Add some perf counters, add some events, and the rest of it. What you're going to find is that a management pack actually gets pushed down, which Microsoft created, which contains the set of rules that are actually going to do that data gathering and everything. That's where that crossover skill set comes in. You can actually disassemble that. I did some early on tweaks where I actually wrote localized overrides to change that behavior through SCOM itself. Probably not a good idea, but a possible idea. So it's out there in my blog history. But you can pretty much do all the core stuff you would need to do directly out of Azure Monitor itself for data gathering, with the exceptions of things like on-prem SQL, like we talked about, and APIs. So for APIs, you have a lot of options. Microsoft's preferred direction, I would bet, is logic apps. So use a logic apps. They've built it really easy to be able to get data out of an API, and then you're using the ingestion API on Log Analytics to get that data in. So that's primary. Second option would be Azure Automation. Third option would be Flow. And then fourth option would probably be Azure Functions. But any of those can get you a really good data ingestion API, pull that data into Log Analytics and let you work with it in essence. The reason why I recommend logic apps is that it's kind of like and I'm going to call, in my personal opinion, not the product team's perspective, of course, it's like the productionized version of Flow, where you can actually create an ARM template to deploy, redeploy code and things of that nature. So that gives you a really good way to just say, hey, here I want to do this. It's not as scary as it sounds. It's probably less than 30 minutes worth of work to be able to communicate to an API and write data to Log Analytics.
I have an interest in Flow. That sounds like a follow-up webinar right there.
Yeah. Also, one more trick: use Postman. If you're trying to figure out how to talk to an API, Postman is just a godsend.
Okay. So I think the Slack channel is kind of slowing down with questions, but I want to just ask one last question and then open it up to see if you guys have anything you want to for closing remarks. But the SCOM Azure Management Pack, in your personal opinion, does it have value?
I've never used it, so I'll let someone else chime in.
I think if it had a lot of value, you probably would have. It depends what you're looking for, right? From my perspective, it doesn't provide me with anything else. I don't get any additional information I can't get anywhere else that's already published by Microsoft.
Okay. Because the way I looked at the Azure Management Pack was that it just brought everything back into SCOM, and if my delivery mechanism to my users was SCOM, then it made sense. But if I was delivering my information a different way, I didn't see any value there. But I was just curious of your opinions on that.
Absolutely, it depends on the scenario you're in and what it is you're looking to achieve.
Okay. And then, so before I turn this back over to Richard, anything that you feel that would be interesting for the audience to know before we close up? Any closing remarks?
Well, I've been asked a lot about any tools to just migrate a management pack to Azure Monitor. And I think we can all agree that there's no good tool to do that.
The management pack in the cloud, I guess, that's an interesting conversation. I always saw that the two were separate, but that interesting.
I can see the logic to it. You've got these great management packs. They do these great things. Why can't we just run them somewhere else? And I see the logic to it.
But that also goes back to the whole OMS discussion about solutions, where I didn't see Azure monitoring necessarily having as many solutions.
They're kind of hidden behind the scenes, just so you know, they're still out there. It's not necessarily as easy to figure out how to be able to add, and they don't seem to be building a lot of new solutions. I think, like I said, I think this Azure Sentinel approach is more the direction that Microsoft is going for how they're going to do solution type functionality going forward. Again, kind of based.
Yeah, and the solutions in Sentinel are based off of the workbooks too, and that's where I think they're going. The solutions aren't really even like management packs. They're really, I think, just a dashboard. I think one or two of them that I can think of actually installed an alert in your Azure Monitor tenant, I guess. But for the most part, they were just dashboards.
So I guess the real takeaway there.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Cameron.
I was just saying you're just gathering data and visualizing data effectively in most cases.
Right.
So I think my takeaway there was Azure Sentinel. That seems to be the sleeper hit for the year, because that wasn't something that was even on my radar. It's definitely something to look at.
Yeah, especially if you like Kusto, like if you've spent time working with the query language, that's got the coolest use cases of Kusto I've seen recently. So very cool stuff.
Okay. Well, at this point, I think we're going to wrap it up. Richard, you still with us?
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much to Shawn for hosting that, and all of our panelists, so Cameron, Billy, David, and Jesper. Absolutely fantastic, packed with information. I think there's plenty more questions that came in that we didn't manage to get through as well. But checking out the Slack channel, it's pretty hot right now. Lots of people piling in. It's not just these 4 experts we have, but I can spot another couple of MVPs, I think, on the Slack channel, and other names there that are very familiar. So I have a feeling our panelists will be continuing the conversation on Slack and just making sure those questions get fully answered. So please do continue that chat. I think just before we went on air, just sort of talking to a couple of the guys here, we were talking about the lack of just clear sort of kind of a clear learning path around Azure Monitor, understanding where to start, where to go next, and that's why I think there are so many questions. So it'd be great to start that conversation now. The plan with this was just really to kick off the debate. We certainly want to continue the debate here at Squared Up with our sort of kind of community resources. So please do stay on that Slack channel and come back to that URL. We'll hopefully plan some other webinars. Hopefully we'll get some of our panelists back again to do a deeper dive on some of these topics. We'll try and get some write-ups on blogs, and we'll certainly share any kind of useful resources that we think are out there for tackling some of these questions around Azure Monitor. So once again, thanks to all our panelists. Thanks to Shawn for hosting that, and thank you to you all for joining us today. Have a great day, and we'll see you on the next one. Cheers, guys.
Thanks, Richard.